Raven's Hollow, nestled deep in the English countryside, was the sort of place where nothing ever happened. The cottages were pristine, the townsfolk predictable, and the communal garden was a haven of tranquility. It wasn't just a garden, it was a living tapestry, woven with vibrant blooms and whispering trees, a playground for children and a retreat for weary souls. That tranquility shattered one October morning when Mrs. Primrose, the village baker, stormed into the constabulary. Her bonnet was askew, her cheeks flushed with panic, and her words spilled out in a torrent of near incoherence. "It's gone. The garden, vanished. And the children. Oh, God, the children." Constable Archer, a wiry man barely a year into his post, stared at her, uncomprehending. But when he followed her to the garden, his disbelief turned to dread. Where the garden had once flourished was now a circle of barren earth, scorched black and steaming faintly in the crisp air. For children had been playing there the evening prior, Sam and Jenny Winthrop, Lucy Pemberton, and George Merriweather. All of them were gone. The garden's wrought iron gate, a charming piece of craftsmanship passed down through generations, was bent inward, its bars twisted unnaturally. Constable Archer stepped cautiously into the circle, his boots crunching on the dry, blackened soil. A fetid stench hung in the air, like rotting meat left too long in the sun. He bent down, his hand brushing against something soft yet sticky. When he lifted it, his face turned ashen. It was a small child's mitten, smeared with a dark, viscous substance that reeked of death. Archer's hand trembled as he pulled his notebook from his pocket. This was no ordinary disappearance. 2 days later, the case landed on my desk. I was in London, nursing a pot of black tea and poring over a different kind of mystery, the sort that involved forged documents and insurance fraud. Routine work, dull and unremarkable, but it paid the bills. The call came from a contact in Scotland Yard. Elric Graves, the voice on the other end drawled, a touch of amusement coloring the weariness. "We've got a real puzzler for you. Ever heard of Raven's Hollow?" I had. Quaint, sleepy, the kind of place that didn't make the papers unless someone's prize marrow broke a record. "What's happened?" "For missing kids," he said. "And a garden that's apparently disappeared. The locals are, well, let's just say they're not pointing fingers at the usual suspects." "Unusual how?" I pressed. He hesitated, then, "They think it's a ghoul." I arrived in Raven's Hollow on the evening train, the countryside slipping by in a blur of fading sunlight and skeletal trees. The air was cold for October, biting against my coat as I stepped off the platform. A horse-drawn cart waited for me, a rarity even for these parts. Constable Archer greeted me at the constabulary. He was young, perhaps too young for a case like this. His hands fidgeted constantly, betraying his nerves. "The villagers are terrified, sir. You'll see for yourself." He wasn't wrong. The streets were unusually quiet for the hour. Curtains twitched as we passed, and I caught glimpses of pale faces pressed to the glass. An old woman hurried across the cobbled road, clutching a rosary to her chest. "They say it was the garden," Archer began hesitantly as we neared the site. "It took them." "The garden took them?" I echoed. He nodded, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Or, something beneath it. The garden was worse than I had imagined. The air itself felt wrong, thick and cloying, as if saturated with death. The once vibrant patch of earth was now a gaping wound, the charred soil stark against the soft greenery that surrounded it. I crouched at the edge, tracing my gloved fingers over the brittle surface. The heat was gone, but something lingered, a faint pulse beneath the earth, a vibration too subtle for the untrained to notice. Archer pointed out the mitten, now bagged and tagged, and the twisted gate. "It's like something was dragged in," he muttered. "Not dragged," I corrected, standing. "Sucked in." The wind stirred, carrying with it a faint sound. At first, I thought it was the breeze through the trees, but no, it was a giggle. Faint, high-pitched, and echoing as though from far below. I returned to the constabulary with more questions than answers. Archer had lit a fire, and its warmth did little to chase the chill from my bones. He brewed us tea while I examined the evidence laid out on the desk, photographs, witness statements, and a crude map of the garden. "You'll want to speak to Father Merryweather," Archer said. "He knows more about the village's history than anyone." And, he hesitated, his hand tightening on the teapot. "There are old stories. Dark ones. About the land." I raised an eyebrow. "What sort of stories?" He glanced toward the door, as though someone might be listening. "The kind that make people lock their doors and pray, sir." Father Merryweather was a frail man, his skin as thin and pale as parchment, but his voice carried the weight of ages. He welcomed me into the rectory with little ceremony, pouring a glass of sherry before settling into a creaking armchair. "The garden," he began, "stands on the site of an old plague pit. Most of the villagers don't know, or if they do, they pretend otherwise. But it's true. During the Black Death, they buried the infected there. Hundreds, maybe more. No prayers, no rites, just bodies thrown into the earth." "And the children?" I asked. His hand shook as he lifted the glass. "There are whispers, of a man named Elias Wren. A grave robber, accused of witchcraft. They say he was buried alive for his crimes, entombed beneath that very soil. And now," he said grimly, "it seems the dead are no longer content to rest." The name Elias Wren lingered in my mind as I walked back to the constabulary that night. The village was unnaturally still, its streets cloaked in a silence that gnawed at the edges of my thoughts. The moon hung low in the sky, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch far too long for their makers. I locked myself in the station and spread out the documents I'd gathered, the map of the village, accounts of the disappearances, and my notes from Father Merryweather's tale. Elias Wren, grave robber, accused necromancer, and the suspected source of the garden's curse. But was he truly the origin of the terror, or merely the first victim? The candlelight flickered, and for a moment, I could swear the shadows on the walls danced of their own accord. The next morning, I sought out Margaret Winthrop, mother of Sam and Jenny, two of the missing children. Her cottage was small and modest, tucked away on the edge of the village. She opened the door with a pale, haunted expression, her eyes red and swollen from sleepless nights. "They were playing," she said, her voice trembling. "Just before dusk. I called them in for supper, but they begged for a few more minutes. She broke off, clutching a handkerchief to her face. "What happened next?" I asked gently. Margaret shook her head. "I heard laughter. Their laughter. And then," she paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. "A sound like tearing. Wet and awful. And then, nothing." She reached into her apron pocket and pulled out a small, broken locket. It was Jenny's. I found it near the gate. The locket was smeared with the same ichor I'd seen at the garden. I returned to the garden under the weak light of afternoon. With a spade borrowed from the constabulary, I began digging at the center of the scorched circle. The soil gave way too easily, as though the earth itself wanted to yield its secrets. About 2 feet down, I struck something hard. Clearing away the dirt revealed a stone slab engraved with the same crude sigil I'd seen carved into the oak tree. A binding mark, Father Merryweather had called it. But the mark was broken, cracked clean through the center. Whatever had been imprisoned here was no longer bound. I returned to the rectory with the slab, the weight of it pulling on my arms and on my mind. Father Merryweather inspected the crack with trembling fingers. "This was no accident," he murmured. "Someone, or something, shattered the seal. Perhaps Elias Wren himself, if the stories are true. Or," he hesitated. "Perhaps it was Fed." "Fed?" I asked sharply. "The binding sigils are designed to weaken over time unless maintained," Merryweather explained. Sacrifices, offerings of flesh and blood, might delay the inevitable, but they also strengthen the creature. In the church's archives, I discovered a centuries-old journal penned by a long-dead rector. The handwriting was spidery, the ink faded, but the words were clear enough to chill my blood. Elias Wren called forth the hungerer, a beast of shadow and bone. He sought power but found torment. The sigil was drawn to bind it, but such things cannot be held forever. If the mark breaks, the hungerer will rise, and no child will be safe. Beneath the passage was a crude illustration of the ghoul. Its form was skeletal, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. Constable Archer found me at the rectory, pale as death. "It's happened again," he stammered. "Another child's missing." The boy was Thomas Burrows, the blacksmith's son, last seen walking near the woods that bordered the garden. His mother swore she saw him standing in the doorway at twilight, murmuring something she couldn't hear, before he simply turned and walked away. When Archer and I reached the woods, we found footprints leading to a shallow hollow among the trees. At the center of the hollow was a small pile of bones, animal, perhaps, but they were gnawed clean. That night, I stayed at the constabulary, poring over every detail of the case. The storm outside battered the windows, the wind howling like a living thing. Sometime past midnight, I heard it, the faint sound of scratching. At first, I thought it was a branch against the glass, but as I moved toward the window, I saw the shadows shift. Something was outside. I threw open the shutters and caught a glimpse of glowing eyes in the darkness, 2 pinpoints of light that burned with an otherworldly intensity. They vanished almost as quickly as they appeared, leaving behind only the sound of retreating footsteps. The following morning, word came from the Pemberton household. Lucy, one of the missing children, had been found wandering near the garden, shivering and pale but otherwise unharmed. Her parents were overjoyed, but when I questioned her, my unease grew. "It told me secrets," Lucy whispered, her voice distant and hollow. "It lives in the ground. It wants more friends. It said I could come back if I helped. I knew where I had to go, the catacombs beneath Raven's Hollow." Father Merriweather hesitated to provide me with a map but relented after I assured him I would not go alone. Archer, to his credit, volunteered to accompany me, though his trembling hands betrayed his fear. Armed with salt, iron, and lanterns, we descended into the dark, ancient tunnels. The walls were lined with skulls, their empty sockets staring at us as we passed. The air grew colder, and the faint smell of rot became almost unbearable. At the deepest point, we found it, a crude altar surrounded by a ring of bones. The ghoul's lair. As Archer and I stepped deeper into the catacombs, the air grew thick with the stench of decay, a putrid scent that clung to our skin and clothes. The tunnel walls seemed to close in, the faint glow of our lanterns flickering against stone etched with strange, cryptic markings. Every step we took was accompanied by the echo of our boots on the damp floor, a sound that seemed unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence. "This doesn't feel right," Archer whispered, his voice trembling. It's as if it's watching us." I couldn't disagree. The sensation of being observed was undeniable, a prickling at the back of my neck that grew stronger with each step. Shadows moved unnaturally at the edges of our lantern light, twisting and bending as though alive. Then, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. My breath caught. The floor was littered with bones, human and animal alike, arranged in chaotic spirals that seemed deliberate in their madness. A crude stone altar stood at the center, slick with a dark, tar-like substance that glistened in the flickering light. Around the altar, symbols were carved into the stone, their jagged lines pulsating faintly as if imbued with some unnatural life. "This is it," I murmured. "The lair of the beast." Archer's face was pale, his knuckles white as he gripped his rifle. "We should leave, Graves. This isn't something we can fight." I stepped closer to the altar, my instincts screaming at me to turn back even as I forced myself forward. There, at the base of the grotesque structure, lay something that froze my blood, a child's shoe, small and scuffed, its laces undone. As I knelt to examine the shoe, a low growl reverberated through the chamber. It wasn't the sound of any natural creature, it was guttural, raw, and filled with a malevolence that made my stomach churn. "Did you hear that?" Archer hissed, raising his rifle. "Quiet," I whispered, straining my ears. The growl came again, louder this time, echoing through the chamber like a rolling tide. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I stood, drawing my revolver, and scanned the shadows. Then, from the far corner of the room, it emerged. The ghoul was more monstrous than I'd imagined. Its emaciated frame was covered in scraps of decaying flesh, its elongated limbs moving with an unnatural grace. Glowing eyes stared at us with a predatory intelligence, and its jaw unhinged impossibly wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth. It clutched something in its clawed hands, a doll, dirt-streaked and missing an eye. Archer's rifle cracked, the sound deafening in the confined space. The bullet struck the creature's shoulder, but it didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head, a grotesque parody of curiosity, before letting out a screech that sent shivers down my spine. "Fall back!" I shouted, grabbing Archer's arm and dragging him toward the tunnel. The ghoul moved faster than I'd thought possible, its clawed feet scraping against the stone as it gave chase. We sprinted through the catacombs, the lantern light bobbing wildly as we ran. The ghoul's guttural screeches echoed behind us, accompanied by the rapid thud of its pursuit. I could hear Archer's panicked breaths, his footsteps stumbling as he struggled to keep up. "Don't stop!" I barked, glancing over my shoulder. The creature was gaining on us, its glowing eyes burning like twin torches in the darkness. Its limbs moved in jerky, unnatural motions, yet its speed was terrifying. I reached into my coat and pulled out a pouch of salt. Without breaking stride, I scattered it behind us, the grain sparkling briefly before falling into the gloom. The ghoul let out a furious shriek, momentarily halted by the barrier. "Salt works?" Archer gasped. "For now," I replied, not daring to slow down. "But it won't hold it forever." We emerged from the catacombs into the pale light of dawn, collapsing onto the grass outside the rectory. The ghoul's screeches faded into silence, but the sense of dread lingered. "This isn't over," I said, staring back at the yawning darkness of the tunnel. The respite was short-lived. News came that the other missing children, Sam, Jenny, and George, had been found wandering near the woods. Like Lucy before them, they were unharmed in body but changed in ways that defied explanation. At the Pemberton household, I examined the children. They sat together in eerie silence, their once bright eyes dull and unfocused. Their skin was cold to the touch, their veins darkened as though their blood had turned to ink. "Do you remember what happened?" I asked gently. Sam, the eldest, turned his hollow gaze toward me. "It lives in the dark," he said in a voice that wasn't entirely his own. "It's hungry." "What does it want?" "To feed," Jenny murmured. "It needs more." The room grew cold, and the children's voices took on a chilling harmony. "It watches. It waits." Father Merriweather and I convened in the church, poring over every scrap of lore and ritual we could find. The binding sigil had been broken, that much was clear. But could it be restored? "There's a way," Merriweather said reluctantly, pointing to a passage in an ancient text. "To rebind the creature, the ritual must be performed at the site of its summoning. Blood is required, innocent blood." I stared at him, my jaw tightening. "You can't be serious. We can't sacrifice a child to save this village." "Not a child," he said softly. "But perhaps, one who is willing." The implication hung heavily in the air. That night, as the storm raged outside, I sat alone in the rectory, contemplating the weight of Merriweather's words. The ghoul's hunger was insatiable, its power growing with each victim. To bind it again would require a life freely given. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. It was Margaret Winthrop, her face pale but resolute. "If it will save the children," she said, her voice steady, "I will give myself." I shook my head. "You don't understand what you're offering. This isn't just death. It's—" "I've already lost my children," she interrupted. "If my sacrifice means they can be saved, then so be it." Her courage was admirable, but I couldn't allow it. There had to be another way. Margaret's offer weighed heavily on my mind. Could I truly allow someone to make such a sacrifice? And if I refused, how many more would the ghoul claim before it was stopped? I spent the rest of the night scouring the catacombs map and every text I had on bindings and warding rituals. There had to be a way to repair the seal without the need for blood. But no matter how deeply I delved, the conclusion was always the same: blood was the linchpin of the ritual. At dawn, I sought Father Merryweather, who met me in the church's sanctuary. The dim light streaming through the stained glass gave the space a ghostly quality, as though even the church feared what we discussed. "There is one more thing," he said, his voice hesitant. "If the creature is drawn back to its binding willingly, if it chooses to return, the blood sacrifice may not be needed." I stared at him. And what could possibly compel it to return willingly? "The children," he said grimly. "They are its tether now. It will come to reclaim them." The realization hit like a blow. The ghoul wouldn't stop until the children were wholly its own. It would hunt them wherever they went, devouring their souls bit by bit. The children were gathered in the rectory's largest room, seated in a tight circle. They looked frail, their pale skin marred with dark veins that seemed to writhe beneath the surface. The air around them was unnaturally cold, the flicker of the lanterns faltering as though the light itself wanted to retreat. Archer stood guard by the door, his hand resting on the rifle he never let go of now. His face was drawn, his nerves frayed to breaking. "Are you sure about this, Graves?" "I'm not sure of anything," I admitted. "But this might be their only chance." I knelt before the children, speaking in a calm, measured tone. "Listen to me. You've seen it. You know what it wants. If we don't stop it, it will come for you again, and it won't stop there. Do you understand?" Sam, the eldest, nodded slowly. It whispers to us," he said. "In our dreams. It says it's hungry. You can help stop it," I said gently. "But I need you to be brave. Can you do that?" They hesitated, fear etched on their young faces. But one by one, they nodded. Night fell quickly, wrapping Raven's Hollow in a suffocating darkness. Armed with lanterns, salt, and iron, I led the children back to the garden, Merryweather and Archer flanking us. The villagers had gathered in the shadows, their pale faces barely visible, muttering prayers under their breath. The scorched earth at the garden's center pulsed faintly, a sickly glow emanating from the cracked seal. I positioned the children in a circle around the sigil, instructing them to hold hands. Merryweather began chanting in Latin, the words of the ritual resonating in the still air. Then it came. The ground beneath us trembled, a deep rumble that felt as though the earth itself were groaning in pain. From the shadows of the woods, the ghoul emerged, its skeletal form illuminated by the lantern light. It moved slowly, deliberately, its glowing eyes fixed on the children. "Hold your ground," I barked, stepping between the creature and its prey. The ghoul hissed, its jaws opening wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth. It lunged, but I threw a line of salt before it, forcing it to recoil with an ear-piercing screech. The ghoul circled us, its movements predatory, its gaze never leaving the children. Merryweather's chants grew louder, his voice trembling but resolute. The symbols carved into the ground began to glow, their light growing stronger as the ritual reached its crescendo. The children began to murmur, their voices joining the chant. Their words were eerie, otherworldly, as though something ancient spoke through them. The ghoul paused, its movements faltering. "It's working," Merryweather whispered. The air grew colder, the wind howling through the garden. The ghoul let out a guttural roar and lunged again, but this time I was ready. I stepped forward, throwing a handful of salt into its face. It recoiled, clawing at the air, its form flickering like a candle about to go out. Back to the earth. I shouted, firing my revolver. The iron bullet struck the creature's chest, and it staggered, falling to its knees. The sigil on the ground flared to life, and the earth beneath the ghoul began to crumble. Tendrils of black ichor rose from the ground, wrapping around its limbs and pulling it downward. It thrashed and screamed, its voice echoing with unholy fury. The children's voices grew louder, their chant reaching a fever pitch. The ghoul let out one final, ear-splitting screech before it was dragged into the earth, the sigil sealing behind it with a burst of light. Then, silence. The children collapsed to the ground, unconscious but alive. Their color began to return, the dark veins fading from their skin. I checked each of them, relief washing over me as I confirmed they were unharmed. The villagers emerged from the shadows, their expressions a mixture of awe and fear. Father Merryweather stepped forward, placing a trembling hand on my shoulder. "You've done it," he said. "No," I replied, staring at the sealed sigil. "We've bought time. Nothing more." As the villagers carried the children home, I lingered in the garden, staring at the place where the ghoul had been bound. The air was still heavy, the faint pulse of the sigil a reminder that the hungerer was not destroyed, only caged. For how long, I couldn't say. But I knew one thing for certain, I would be ready when it returned. The storm passed, and so did the immediate danger. The ghoul was gone, bound once more beneath the earth. The children slept soundly in their homes, their pale faces regaining some color, and the village began to breathe again. But as I stood in the darkened rectory, staring into the flames of the dying hearth, the unease remained, coiling like a snake around my thoughts. It wasn't the first time I had encountered a creature of hunger and corruption. My mind drifted unbidden to years long past, when I was a younger man, less certain of my skills and more willing to chase shadows into the night. Those were the days when I trained under my mentor, Sebastian Crow, a man as sharp as iron and twice as unyielding. I could almost hear his voice as the memories came flooding back. "You need to understand something, Elric," Crow had said, pacing the study of his crumbling estate. The room reeked of old parchment and pipe smoke, the walls lined with shelves of occult lore. A ghoul isn't just a mindless beast. It's a tragedy made flesh. I'd been skeptical then, eager to reduce monsters to their simplest forms. Tragedy? It's a corpse eater, Sebastian. A scavenger at best. Crow had paused, fixing me with his hawkish stare. And why do you think it eats the dead? Why does it linger in places steeped in pain and loss? It's not just hunger, boy, it's despair. Ghouls aren't born, they're made. Every one of them carries a story, and that story is a wound that never healed. Now, years later, those words carried a weight I hadn't understood at the time. Elias Wren, the man whose death had seeded this horror in Raven's Hollow, wasn't just a monster. He was a man who had fallen into darkness, his deeds damning him in life and binding him in death. As the fire crackled low, I began to wonder, had the ghoul's hunger been born of choice, or was it merely a curse imposed on a soul already broken? The memory shifted, taking me further back to a case Crow and I had worked together. It was the first time I had encountered a ghoul, though I hadn't known its name then. The case was in a forgotten village in the Scottish Highlands, a place as cold and desolate as its people. "They call it the Banished One," Crow had told me as we walked the winding paths through the mist-shrouded hills. "It prowls the burial grounds, stealing the dead. They've tried to kill it, pitchforks, torches, even silver. None of it worked." "Why not?" I'd asked, my youthful confidence masking my unease. Crow had gestured to the soil beneath our feet. "Because it isn't just a creature, Elric. It's tied to this land, to the people here. You don't kill a ghoul with brute force. You unravel it." When we reached the burial grounds, I saw what he meant. Graves had been unearthed, their contents scattered, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Crow knelt by a disturbed grave, brushing aside the loose soil with a reverence that surprised me. "Look," he said, pointing to the markings scratched into the wood of the broken coffin. "Runes. These aren't here by accident." I leaned closer, the fog damp against my skin. The runes were crude but unmistakable, a series of protective symbols, etched into the wood with desperate hands. "Someone was trying to ward off the creature," I said. Crow shook his head. "No. Someone was trying to trap it. This isn't just a ghoul, it's bound to the bodies it defile. Whoever marked this coffin knew that." The confrontation that followed was chaos. The ghoul, a towering, emaciated figure of horror, had attacked us with the ferocity of a starving animal. My revolver had been useless, the bullets seeming to pass through it like smoke. Crow had relied on something far more potent, a mixture of salt and iron, burned together to create a purifying flame. "Salt cleanses," he told me later as we patched our wounds. "And iron binds. Remember that, Elric. Monsters may be terrifying, but they're still bound by rules." I had thought little of his words then, focused as I was on surviving the ordeal. But now, standing in Raven's Hollow, those lessons came back with startling clarity. The final lesson from Crow was one I'd tried to forget, though its echoes haunted me still. It had been the night he died, a night of blood and fire that marked the end of my apprenticeship and the beginning of my own path as an investigator. We had been hunting a ghoul that stalked the ruins of a battlefield, feeding on the remains of soldiers long forgotten. It was no ordinary creature, it was ancient, its form bloated and twisted with centuries of malice. Crow had known the danger, but he had pressed forward anyway, driven by a stubborn determination I didn't yet understand. The fight had been brutal. Crow's methods, salt, fire, and invocation, had weakened the creature, but it was his knowledge that ultimately destroyed it. He had spoken words in a language I didn't recognize, words that resonated with power and despair. The ghoul had screamed, its body collapsing into ash, and the weight of its presence lifted from the air. But the cost had been great. Crow had collapsed shortly after, his breathing shallow and labored. I'd knelt beside him, panic rising as I realized he was slipping away. "You listen to me, Elric," he'd said, his voice a rasp. "Monsters like these, they feed on more than flesh. They feed on your fear, your regrets, your doubts. Don't let them take more from you than they already have." He died that night, and I'd buried him in the very battlefield he'd sought to cleanse. Now, as I stared at the sealed sigil in the heart of Raven's Hollow, I could hear his voice once more. The ghoul was gone, but the echoes of its hunger remained, a reminder of the darkness that lingered in the shadows of the world. "Don't let them take more from you than they already have," I murmured to myself. The lessons of Crow were etched into my very soul, guiding me even now.